All right, welcome everybody to our tour of the orchestra presentation for today. I'm pleased to introduce our principal tuba, Glen Dimick. He's been with the symphony since 2009, so I think this is his 12th season with us now, which is wonderful. And I'm gonna let him introduce himself and give a little bit about his background, and then he's got plenty to share with us about the tuba. Take it away, Glen.
All right, thanks, Amy. So, yes, I have been playing the Terre Haute Symphony for a little bit now. I taught at Indiana State starting at the same time until about 2016. I taught tuba and a couple other skills courses and the like. So I originally got my undergraduate at IU. I was born in Wisconsin, wanted to go to Madison to be with my friends. My mom said, "Son, you don't have any friends, send me down to IU," which I'm ever thankful for. And so I did my undergraduate there, and then went and lived in Chicago for a few years and did my master's at DePaul University with the tuba player from the San Francisco Symphony who lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and commuted to Chicago once every 2 weeks. So you should be getting an idea for how weird we are. And then after that, I came back down to IU and did the coursework for my doctorate. And that ended about 2009. And because I was midstream, I decided it was a good time to change horses or ride two at once. So I went back and I got a degree in radiation therapy and eventually what's something called medical dosimetry. And so I split my time now between performing, teaching, and designing radiation plans for people in the oncology wing of the VA up in Indianapolis. So it's kind of, it comes into play later. It becomes relevant, but so it's kind of a spread across the board life. So anyway, let me get started with a few things about the tuba. Share. I have too many cameras.
Okay. By the way, while Glen's getting set up here, just a reminder that if you have questions, please type those into the chat, and then I will walk through those questions with Glen at the end of the session.
Yes, please do. So anyway, any good discussion of the humanities begins, let's see, with a physics lesson. And so this has been covered in a few of the other lectures so far, but I kind of wanted to put my own take on it because I think it's actually really interesting. So I won't get too in-depth into the nuts and bolts, but just understanding how an instrument creates a sound, creates a pitch, I think is really interesting. So we've got essentially frequency. A pitch has to do with the speed of its frequency. And because the only reason that tubas and trombones and horns are shaped the way they are is because we don't all have a giant mountainside to stretch them out on. I'm showing you this Alpenhorn over here. It's the most basic representation of what we do. Just a straight tube. If I had enough real estate, I could have a tuba that extended, straight ahead, and it would sound just fine, probably. But so you see on the bottom there with the string instrument, we have a string stretched over two tension points, and whenever they play, the sound wave moves from one end of it to the other and back. And that is one cycle. That is one cycle. So like, for example, when we talk about A440, like tuning the instrument, the orchestra to A440, that particular frequency, that note is 440 cycles per second. So you can't perceive them. They're going incredibly fast. And so in order to change the pitch or the frequency that is being played, they put their finger down and shorten the string so that basically the road is not nearly as long. brass players can't do that. As you until we have valves later, we only have that real estate right there, that stretch of road, and so the sound wave will travel from our lips down to the end of the instrument and then back, and that's one cycle. And so as I play, the only way to change any pitch on that instrument, unless I have valves, is to change the speed of the wind. So basically what's happening is I can't change the length of the road, but I can change the speed of the car. And whereas the string player would actually just change the length of the road. And so we have what I know has been shown in a couple of these lectures, but it's the overtone series. And so whenever I talk to you about, I play a C tuba, or as you see up there, a double C tuba, I'll talk about that in a second, or an F tuba, or somebody says they play a B flat trumpet, it means the fundamental pipe, if you don't put any valves down, is going to be that note. So in my case, it's a very specific note, and here it is on the piano. That's the fundamental frequency of my instrument. So if I pick up a tuba, so you can see that, I mean, most people don't perceive that note. Like even when I was doing juries with, higher brass people, woodwind people that didn't quite hang around in that register, if my students would come and play in that register, like a scale or something, they'd pretty much just look at me and be like, and I didn't go like that or that, and then they'd know how to grade them. But the point is, that's the lowest main frequency I can play, no valves. Now each number there that you see is me multiplying the speed of my air by that number. So if I blow twice as fast, I get that second note there, that C. And if I blow 3 times as fast, I get the third note, that G. And then 4 times as fast, I get that C. And so I can keep going up. Etc. Up, 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 up. And I can play all those notes just by changing the speed of the air. And that's how a brass instrument works. And, if you heard the earlier lectures, you saw that brass instruments basically came about because people like to pick up random objects and blow on them. And eventually they found ones that kind of worked with a specific kind of sound. And they discovered just this natural sort of law of physics there. And so, we improved on it later on by adding machinery and valves and different mechanisms to change things. But brass players are the only instruments that I know of that use these 2 different methods for changing pitch, which can get really confusing. And so we have valves. And the 2 valves that you're going to see, there are many more valves that are lost in the depths of history, and I think maybe a couple museums in Paris might have some. But right now we have piston valves and rotary valves. And let's see. So here, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second. Let's see, here is an example of a rotary valve. I'm going to take the top off of this one. This is my thumb valve. And I don't know that you'll be able to see it. You probably won't. So behind here, we have a valve that actually turns and diverts the wind along a different path until it comes back and then moves along. It's kind of like a detour. And what that does is it makes the road longer. And if I can bring this back. Pardon me, technical difficulty. There we go.
Yeah, don't break your instrument, Glenn.
I do that every day. So let me share again. Okay, so anyway, you can see it basically makes the instrument longer by diverting the air through a bunch of tubing and then back to where, you know, it began. Now, if this was like, you can't find any detour maps that really, you know, show it, but if this was truly accurate, that detour would end right where it began. You just keep going down the road you weren't supposed to go down. But the point is, that makes the frequency lower because it takes longer for the vibration to travel from the player to the end of the horn and back. And so by lengthening the road and shortening the road, it changes the frequency. And by speeding up the car, by speeding up the wind, you can change frequency that way too. So it can get a little bit confusing, but somehow it works. Okay. So the tuba that most people are familiar with is called the contrabass tuba. It's keyed in double C or double B flat. A little bit of history. It's called the Helmholtz pitch notation. It refers to a specific note, like a specific note on the piano. That one that I played for you, that is double C. And then the C above it is a single C, and then it has a notation for every C on the piano. So if I just say I'm going to play a C, there are, you know, pretty much unlimited pitches to choose from. Which C are you talking about? And so it's in the contra octave, which is why it's called the contrabass tuba. It doesn't have a problem with the Nicaraguan government or anything like that. It's just a contrabass instrument. And so, I mean, and that's actually, you'll like contrabassoon, you know, anything. It's talking about a specific octave, a specific place in the frequency, which is quite low. And so, yeah, most of the tubas that you see in schools, if you have any, you know, high schoolers or middle schoolers that you know that play tuba, they play B flat. That's what everybody starts on. I can't tell you why, except for history and probably money. But that's where we start. Neither of these horns that I have here are B flat instruments, but if I needed to pick one up and play it, it wouldn't be a problem because we all learn on them. These are the big tubas, the ones you see in concert bands, the one you see in orchestras. They have sort of that stereotypical broad, big sound that people are used to. So that's an example of an excerpt from Petrushka, you know, a pretty broad ballet that has, you know, a lot, you know, of small moments and big moments. So depending on what you're doing, you're going to choose the tuba for the moment. The other is called the bass tuba. And those tend to be keyed in F or E flat, not double F, not double E flat, although those notes exist. So that's an octave above. You can still play low on these tubas, and they still, you know, definitely hold their own in orchestra and are quite often used as specialty instruments in orchestra. I play them quite often, but they also tend a little bit more toward a focused sound, not quite as broad, a little bit more manageable when it comes to, you know, brass quintet or solo recitals. I'm not saying you can't play a contrabass tuba on a solo recital. A lot of people, you know, wind up doing that, including myself, but these just tend to be a little bit better suited to that task. And so here, I'll stop sharing for a second so it's a little easier. So yeah, here's an F tuba, and I'll see if I can not destroy my equipment. Here's the F. and then here's the C. So it may not look immediately different, but they actually produce very different sounds. And so yeah, so these are pitched in F and E flat. F, you're going to find more. It's a national thing. You find more F tubas in America and Germany. You're going to find E flat tubas in the UK. It's mainly a tradition thing, but you know, the more the world globalizes, the more you see them all over the place. So it's not quite what it used to be, but so yeah, that is an F tuba, and I'll be playing both tubas a bit later on for some specific orchestral works. Here we go. All right, so these guys, I think maybe I'm covering up one of the faces here, but the tuba came very late in terms of well, at least brass instruments anyway. It was the last sort of modern brass instrument to be invented. They had to go through all the mistakes first. And so that's one of the reasons a tuba, even though I've been talking about the CC tuba or the F tuba, we don't transpose as a rule. Like the B flat trumpets and C trumpets, you're going to be transposing. You're not going to be necessarily looking at what we call concert pitch. And so the reason for that is we never had to deal with crooks. And you may remember from the other brass lectures that they essentially ripped out most of the guts of their instrument and put in a different set of guts. And that changed the key back then. But they still only had those overtones that I played at the beginning. They only had access to those. So you had to change your crook if you wanted to play well in a specific key. And so as a result, they had to be able to take the crook out and look at the same music, and it would just have it in a different key. So they started transposing. And because there's this wealth of literature that no one's ever really bothered to fix, they transpose to this day. And it's just a tradition that came up out of it. There isn't really a particularly compelling reason for them to transpose, except that it's been done this way for a long time, and it's how the system works, and it's fine. But since the tuba was invented after people, you know, had figured out valves, had figured out sort of modern technology, as a result, we don't transpose. If I teach a student an F tuba, he has to relearn all his fingerings. So it's just the way it is. It's, you know, it's kind of tradition. Anyway, so late to the party is 1835. And really, you don't see, I mean, you see a lot of music that tuba is played upon, but actually was written for an earlier historical instrument at this time. It's not really until like the 1850s and beyond that you see a lot of orchestral music that was actually written with tuba in mind. So, you know, Beethoven's death coincides very closely with the invention of the tuba. You can work that one out for yourself. But for example, I believe Gustav Mahler rewrote Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and added a tuba part. Thought he would have loved it. Who knows? It's been a controversial instrument since, you know, its inception for obvious reasons. First tuba was actually a bass tuba, keyed in F, and as you can see down there, it doesn't look all that much like what we play, but you can kind of see that it would be playable by a modern instrumentalist. But, you know, obviously over time, you can see that, you know, the bell has changed. You know, back then they cut it off about there. And now we have a significant flare just for the acoustical properties of it. And, you know, the modern instruments project quite a bit more than the old ones. And I think I might have seen this question go across the screen. Baritones and euphoniums. The big difference, if you listen to the horn lecture, you heard about conical versus cylindrical instruments, and this is a pretty good picture to be able to show you how that works. Aside from sort of the obvious differences of the configuration of the pipe, you may notice, look at the bottom part of the instrument. We call this the bottom bow, sort of the U at the very bottom. And a euphonium is conical, which means that starting with the lead pipe, very slowly throughout the instrument, it's, the bore size, the diameter of the pipe grows. Whereas with cylindrical instruments like trumpets and trombones, the bells don't flare, the pipes don't, the bells do flare, but the pipes don't flare until the very end. And so you get a very different sound. And so euphoniums and baritones are keyed in B flat. They are exactly half the length of double B flat tuba. And so they're equal to the length of a trombone, which is why you see a lot of trombonists doubling on euphonium. So most of the time, if somebody comes up to you and tells you that their child plays baritone, they're lying, because for some reason, and I know it's partially historical, the mistake of calling euphoniums baritones, we've just, woven it into our society's DNA. And so a baritone horn is almost never what you see in a school. I'm saying almost never, because there are plenty of schools that have had horns around for a long time, and they may have baritones, but almost every time somebody tells you they play a baritone or somebody plays a baritone, it's probably a euphonium. And so, they're sometimes called tenor tubas. They are absolutely in the tuba family. They're similar design, just, pint size. Okay, and getting into some of the other instruments. Now, for a moment, I'm going to break my PowerPoint here because I want to read you a quote. So, a little background for this instrument. Verdi, wonderful composer, had some opinions. This is a quote regarding one of the premieres of his operas and the scoring of it. And it is, "I wish to insist again on a fourth trombone. I would prefer a trombone basso, which is one of the same family as the others. If this turns out to be too much trouble and it is too difficult to play, then get again one of those ordinary ophiclides that go down to a low B. In fact, use anything you like, but not that devil of a tuba, which does not blend with the others." So, somebody had some latent issues about tubas, but, I understand, because it was definitely a very surprising instrument at that time to especially a lot of the opera composers that were trying to score for voice and instrumentalists. So we have the cimbasso, late invention, and it's mainly used in, well, at least its initial use was in Italian opera. Puccini, Verdi. I've been lucky enough to borrow one, and I got to play with Indianapolis Chamber Orchestra. They did a couple Puccini operas, and I got to play cimbasso in them. It's a lot of fun. They're keyed differently. The one I played happened to be keyed the same as an F tuba, so it was a very easy transition. It's kind of hard to really explain how this thing gets held, but you have to sit. This is not a standing instrument. And you lean it back against you, and you just make sure nobody's sitting behind you or in front of you or really anywhere around you. And it sounds kind of like a throatier trombone. It got picked up quite a lot by film composers. Really love the sound. It didn't have the breadth of the tuba. It still kind of had the focus of the trombone, but in a very low register. So if you ever watch the Lord of the Rings movies, if there's an orc running towards you, you can probably hear a cimbasso, or just any number of films. The cimbasso was a very popular instrument. Slight tangent, because early recording was not so great, it was very difficult to pick up the sound of a lot of the early tubas, because there are a lot of overtones, but it wasn't as focused. And so it got really popular to record instruments like this because they were picked up on early recording devices far more easily. Okay, I mentioned the ophicleide, and there it is, or there are two of them. So, it's kind of what happens like when an elementary school kid goes to lunch with those segmented trays and just squishes everything together. It has keys like a saxophone or any number of woodwind instruments, but a brass mouthpiece. And there's some very sketchy story, which is absolutely not true, that was that Adolf Sax, the inventor of the saxophone, was cleaning an ophicleide and stuck a reed on it and liked it and thus invented the saxophone. It's not true, but people found it entertaining enough to start passing it around. But you get the idea. It's definitely, I wish I had a recording of it for you that I could play. It may be worth looking up. So it was invented, a couple decades before the tuba. And so it was around, much smaller sound, not nearly as much projection, which worked for some scoring. A lot of Mendelssohn, the parts that I play, if I play a Midsummer Night's Dream, say ophicleide on it. And the one time I did play it in Indianapolis, they came and asked me if I had an ophicleide, because who doesn't? It definitely probably would fit the texture quite a bit better of a piece like that. But, I'm not going to go get an ophicleide. I already have enough toys. So one of the most famous pieces for tuba, and we played this fairly recently in Terre Haute, Berlioz Symphony Fantastique. And it's famous because for tuba players, because in the fifth movement, two tuba players sit back there and play the Dies Irae about as loud as they possibly can, depending on the restraint of the conductor. And so that was originally supposed to be played on two of these instruments. Now, a lot of people will say, they should be played on ophicleides because that's what he wanted. It's not true, because once the tuba was invented, Berlioz heard it and he was like, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do now. And he ran back and he scratched out ophicleide off of all his parts and he wrote tuba in them. So he gets to rewrite his own history. So you could do an entire lecture on him and how much he liked to, overload the brass. But that's another day. Okay, it's something a little bit more familiar, the sousaphone. It's actually kind of a fascinating instrument because you find it in a lot of places where you might not expect. 1893, I imagine there was some form of sousaphone around before that. I don't think you just come up with this as your first prototype. It was by J.W. Pepper, but at the request and the direction of John Philip Sousa, for obvious reasons. He wanted to march. Tubas didn't want to march. And so he invented a torture device that would force them to. And so the sousaphone was born. I have what's called a helicon here. I don't have a sousaphone. So I believe this instrument is from about 1912. Either way, I'm probably breathing in cadmium, just holding it near. It's not necessarily the most modern instrument, but we wear it like this. And a sousaphone, the bell would point a little bit more forward. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen them, it's very useful for outdoor music. Anytime you have to be walking around, which turns out is more times than you ever expected when you pick up a tuba. So, yeah, that's the sousaphone, but it's actually quite interesting. You find, because of British colonialism, you head over to India, and you find them in a lot of wedding bands and different. There's actually a tradition over there that I never expected. I was lucky enough to be there in 2006 or so, and never really expected the tuba to make its way, but it did, and also it became very popular. Mexican banda music, mariachi, a lot of different traditions, just because of, you can kind of tell a history of the world based on, you know, where tubas wound up where you wouldn't expect them to. So, you know, and also Dixieland music, early jazz. The tuba actually was the primary bass instrument in jazz music before the string bass. It was not until the 1920s that the string bass actually, you know, replaced it, and it kind of fell out of favor. And that was also because of technology, because they, you know, string bass needed to have a way to project, and these methods weren't readily available. And, you know, especially when they did a lot of outside music. And so as the traditions of jazz changed, the tuba kind of got swallowed up for a while and then made a return later, because every instrument, you know, has gotten its time in the sun with jazz, because, you know, jazz is a very inclusive art form. All right. So I've got a couple excerpts for you guys. This is the Dragon Solo from Das Rheingold. I'm going to mispronounce a lot of words, so I apologize in advance. This is a particular part of the opera where the dwarf Alberich is being taunted into, you know, showing the power of the ring that he's stolen. I mean, if you get this one confused with Tolkien, you're going to be forgiven. And so he puts on the ring and turns into a dragon. And then they're like, well, I bet you can't turn into a toad. And he's like, well, yeah, I can. And they do. And then they like put a cup over him, and, you know, they beat him that way. But it's a very creepy scene. I was lucky enough to see it in Chicago many years ago. And it's kind of one of the premier places in opera where modern opera houses are trying to perfect special effects, you know, smoke and mirrors and all that. And I mean, it was just cool. They did a really cool shadow thing, and it really underscores the music. But it's one of the more famous tuba solos in opera because it actually uses the tuba idiomatically, you know, to accomplish its purpose. So you hear a lot of swelling. You can almost kind of hear, you know, the shape of the character shifting, and also just a sense of danger, which is usually what people experience when I'm playing, but, you know, at this time it's on purpose. I'll stop the share. Oops. Okay. So this is going to be on the contrabass tuba. Okay, so that was the Dragon Solo. So by the time it's done, I think he's a toad, but at least for part of it. He's a dragon, and that's the earliest excerpt that I chose for you guys. I'm going to kind of go in chronological order. So this is a good example of, you know, a tuba and its, you know, inception. Then we have Gustav Mahler, who I mentioned earlier. One of his most famous works for tuba is in this third movement of the First Symphony, which I believe we also played a year or two ago in Terre Haute. And so I don't know. I've been there for 12 years. It could have been a year or 10 ago.
I think, it was within the last 5 years, certainly.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I have no memory. So the third movement has a round form that kind of made popular by Row, Row, Row Your Boat. But it's a funeral march. It's a little bit darker, and it actually uses the tune Frère Jacques. And for a long time, people thought that it was Mahler's clever idea to turn it minor and to contextualize it that way in the symphony. But it turns out that actually a bunch of people were kind of going goth and emo at the time, and so it was common practice to play "Are You Sleeping" in a minor key, which you can interpret that as you like. So it starts in the bass, moves to the bassoon, and then the tuba takes it up. Meanwhile, the timpani is kind of providing us a creepy backdrop, but it's a pretty affecting piece of music. Oh, and I'm playing this on the F tuba. And that note goes on for about 40 minutes, so I'm not going to play all of it. That is the third movement of Mahler's First Symphony, nicknamed the Titan, but not always by him. Okay, you're going to see kind of a running theme here. So Stravinsky, I like him because he was really contrary. He wasn't a huge fan of brass instruments, kind of as a whole. Like he was fine with them. He used them to great effect, wonderfully. He liked drier instruments in his opinion. He did not like instrumentalists coming and interpreting his music. One of his famous things was he wrote a very high bassoon solo at the very beginning of his Rite of Spring. Especially at the time, people struggled to play it and it sounded kind of, hoarse. But over time, people got far better at playing in that range. And now a bassoon plays, it's just gorgeous, it's beautiful. He would have hated that. He actually said, if I had known that people were going to get good at this, I would have written an octave higher. So he was very much big on composer and control and just having types of timbres, types of sounds that he, not the instrumentalist, gets to be in charge of. And so this is another excerpt from that previous ballet, Petrushka. And it's got a whole storyline involving puppets and a love triangle and all this stuff. But when the tuba comes in, we're not really interested in that. He wants a bear to walk across the stage. And so, okay. He really wanted it to be guttural. He wanted it not to be pretty. Of course, we all try to play pretty because that's what music schools tell us to do. It's another famous sort of use of the instrument, and I like it. I think he does some amazing stuff, and even if he was a bit grumpy about us trying to make the music our own. He would have laughed at me for those air balls that I played there, and so that's what he wanted. So that's what I'm gonna for him anyway. So yeah, that is another use of the tuba, kind of as a character. It's very often used as a character. I mean, both in traditional classical music, often TV, movie. I don't think there's any instrument used more to represent a character. I'm not going to tell you what that character typically looks like, but the tuba found its niche there. Okay, so. And these got in order. So another use of the tuba. So Stravinsky kind of pioneered this type of music called primitivism. And it was kind of a reaction, because all music is a reaction to other music, to the lush harmonic, texture of the Romantic period, and a lot of what was going on right there. This was the idea of bringing music back to very rhythmic, primal origins, with kind of like putting the edges back on. And so this piece, Senza Maya, it's based on a poem, and I'm sorry, I'm just not even going to read the author's name. You can read it there, and you'll probably pronounce it better in your head. But Silvestre Revueltes composed the music based on the poem, and it's really interesting. I looked up a video of somebody reciting the poem. And, I played Senza Maya. It's a standard tuba excerpt, and I know the piece very well. I don't know why I never looked at the poem, because I realized that it's the vocal inflections that you make while you're reading the poem that half of the rhythms and half of the melodies come from. So that was really cool. And so this is describing a ritual for killing a snake. So, I didn't really think I would have to go anywhere near snake sacrifice when picking up the tuba, but apparently that's just not the case. And so it's a very repetitive, sort of rhythmic, sort of muscular theme, as described in many liner notes. It's supposed to be mysterious, but just kind of off-putting, which is, at least one of those things describes the tuba. So there's a lot more to it, but you can see it's not like using this huge, vocabulary of notes there, a lot of oscillation, a lot of repetition, but there is progression in it. It's become a mainstay of rhythmic accuracy in tuba auditions. Not the Terre Haute one, although maybe now it will be. But that's Senza Maya. And then we made it all the way to 1940. Paul Henneman was definitely one of the champions of the tuba. He gave us one of our first tuba sonatas that anyone pays attention to. That particular piece is not so tonal, and it's very angular. And my teacher decided that I should learn it in 8th grade, and I think it's had detrimental effects on my psyche ever since. But there's no way to record that. However, this piece, Symphonic Metamorphosis, it's a very popular one. It was written with American orchestras in mind, and it has a lot of influence of American music at the time, as I say down there, jazz with syncopated rhythms, like sort of his interpretation of jazz, which isn't quite what they were thinking at the time, but actually turns out to be really cool just as its own art form. And so this is from the Scarecrow. I'm going back to the C tuba. You'll probably hear why. I'll play two different sections from it. The first is, it's kind of the call and response. It starts very small, this theme, and it gets repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated, layering on instruments until at the end the low brass come in and, you know, kind of push the train forward. But it's a very cool piece. If you aren't familiar with it, it's definitely worth a listen. Which has a little bit more of his idea of jazz in it. So you can hear a little bit of a bass line. See if you can pick it up. That is Symphonic Metamorphosis. And so I know I'm getting a little light on time here.
You're okay. You're good.
Oh, okay. I have just a little bit more to play for you guys. So, you know, most people still don't really see the tuba as a solo instrument, and that's fine. I used to have a problem with that, but then I grew up. You know, it does have a lot of capabilities that I think people don't realize. And so, fortunately, we have composers like Vaughan Williams that gave it a chance, and I misspelled that. Okay, we're going to fix that PowerPoint. So he was getting on in years. We were about 1954 here, and he composed, among other things, I believe a saxophone concerto, a tuba concerto, and as a result of some of those pieces, people thought that he was just kind of losing it. But it's really become a mainstay of the tuba repertoire. It's the first time anybody took a chance and wrote a concerto for tuba, and it's actually quite popular when it gets played. And so I wanted to play a little bit of that for you guys. I'm not going to play too much, just a little bit from the first and second movement to kind of give you an idea of what a tuba solo might sound like in that context. So that's a little bit of the first movement. here's a little bit of the second, the Romanza. This one is a lot of times requested without the other two for auditions, like Chicago Lyric Opera. They didn't want to bother with the first movement. The second was what they wanted to hear, because it's not too often that a tuba gets a melody that anybody might label as pretty, or melodic, or song-like. But this is definitely an example of such. Somebody steals our music, we steal everybody else's. Bach, everybody that didn't bother to live to see us. But this is the one time when cello players actually come looking for our music, and bass trombonists too. But there's actually a famous recording of Andrew Lloyd Webber's brother, I think it is, playing this piece on cello quite beautifully. All right, so last slide had a misspelled composer on it, but we're just gonna soldier on. Okay, there we go. I think the screen is done. All right, so I've got one more thing to play for you guys, and wouldn't be a tuba lecture if it didn't get a little strange. This is a piece called Fnug. It was written by a tubist called Øystein Bodsvik, famous Norwegian tuba player who, delved into a lot of his compositional abilities. Fnug literally means small, insignificant nothing. So, you get an idea of his self-esteem, but we'll evaluate that in another lecture. It uses a particular extended technique called multiphonics. And I believe Randy Mitchell may have demonstrated that in his lecture, but this is sort of a different take on it. And essentially, the way you accomplish that is, as you are playing, you start singing. Now, it distorts the sound quite a bit, and it distorts the singing, but somehow the melding of the two has captured enough interest for it to exist in pieces like this. So I'll give you sort of an example of what a tuba extended technique would be. I won't start with the multiphonics, but you'll know when it happens. So that's what you do if you can't afford a didgeridoo. And that is the tuba.
I was going to say, that sounds exactly like a didgeridoo or something.
That was very much the intent. We just built a folk instrument. We reverse engineered something.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful presentation. Reminder to everybody, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. I've gotten a few as Glen was giving his presentation here. So we'll go ahead and we'll let Glen have a glass of water and breathe a little bit.
It's all good.
we'll
I'm
take
ready
a look
whenever.
Okay. So I think we already touched on this. Betsy Frank was asking about the difference between the baritone, the euphonium, and the tuba. So you had a really nice slide there that I think really talked about the difference between those two. Do students typically start on the euphonium or the baritone before they start on the tuba, or?
It's very much dependent on, I mean, school district to school district. Mm. I mean, when I started band in Frozen, Wisconsin, I started in 5th grade and they had a tuba ready for me. And so I could choose that instrument. And it was fine. There's no physical limitation there. The other tuba player in my band in 5th grade sat on a phone book to play it. He was fine. But around here, a lot of people tend to start on euphonium, and a lot of the younger bands don't have tubas available. They're not as easy. I mean, they're more expensive, cumbersome instruments, and for whatever reason, I've noticed in at least the Indiana schools that I've seen, that they tend to start on euphonium or start on trombone and then switch maybe a year or two down the line. So,
yeah,
I don't think any band director would say no if a kid brought a tuba and said, "I want to play it," because
of course,
straight gold.
Yeah.
But
when I was in middle school, we needed a tuba player in our middle school band. We had one tuba, and the director wanted 2. And he actually asked one of our flute players to switch to tuba simply because the air.
Yep.
Because flute players, you have to use a ton of air. There's no resistance, and it's about the same amount of air you got to use for tuba. So we actually had a flute player switch to tuba, and it worked great.
It's actually, it's a pretty common thing, and it does work really well. And I think it almost sometimes works better than like switching from high brass, because you're totally okay. You don't have any context, and you're just using the wind you were using before, and it actually works really well. So
yeah. Okay, so how much do tubas cost?
That can vary quite a bit, as I'm sure every instrument does. But you can, like when I'm trying to get my students, the college students, to consider purchasing their own horns, it's like not all of them have the funds, and you can get one for probably about $2,000 that is functional, that would actually get a college student through. And that's because of late there have been a lot of knockoffs of normal horns that have no right to be as good as they are. They're made by a lot of factories in Asia started copying like the German designs and all that, and somehow it's all legal. But as a result, you have like a whole slew of instruments that are a lot cheaper and are actually pretty decent, and a decent choice for a student that can't afford what's going to be more like $8,000 to $15,000 for a professional grade instrument. Now, fortunately, of all the things I've ever owned, they've accumulated the most value, and so you can buy a tuba for about $8,000 one year, and a couple of years later it's worth 13 or 14, which I wouldn't start buying tuba stock now, but it's at least the instruments hold their value. And I've seen upwards of $20,000 to $30,000 for some orchestral instruments that people really prize. I have to say I've played them, and it's just my opinion, but I don't think that I like mine better, and it wasn't anywhere near that. So yeah, it's a wide scale. So getting kids started off, it can be kind of difficult when you have that price point.
Yeah, absolutely. So then it sounds like typically kids will start to purchase their own instruments if they're going to pursue music in college. You don't see a lot of high schoolers or middle schoolers owning their own tubas.
I mean, the ones that like just know from the get-go that they're going to do this.
Sure.
And, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I've had a couple, and I did in high school. I was very excited about it, and so but I had problems. Then, yeah, a lot of times, at least at a place like ISU, I think anyone going into like a big performance-based school will typically come with their own instrument, but college is often the time in which they.
Is there a big price difference between the C and the F tuba? Or are they?
They're very similar.
Oh, okay.
I mean, it isn't like, okay, the C does have more metal and all that, and thus is more expensive, but it's pretty close. Like I purchased my tubas for within a couple $100 of each other as far as their price points were. It's more like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and they kind of sit, both sit on those tiers.
Okay, all right. Okay, we had Sherry Daly as a joke. She said, "Do you smoke?" Just kidding. Do you exercise or something for lung power?
First of all, my teacher at IU, who I'm not going to name, well, I just gave it away. He definitely spent a good deal of his life doing that, and he doesn't anymore. But you would be surprised. No, it's not good for you. But you would be surprised how many wind players and brass players smoke. But as far as I personally think that the better condition you feel like your body's in, cardiovascularly, any instrument's going to be easier, but not necessarily the tuba any more than another. One of the most famous tuba players, Arnold Jacobs, who played in Chicago Symphony, he's kind of known as the grandfather of all modern brass pedagogy. Amazing player. He had one lung. He had.
Oh, wow.
And I believe that was due to smoking. He lost the ability to use both, and so he still sounded amazing. He had to breathe more than other people did, but it was about airflow efficiency and that kind of thing. So when you go running and you have like this really cardiovascular, like almost a breath, there's usually more tension than you want there. So you don't have to be in great shape to, I think, play the instrument. I don't think it hurts.
Yeah. I love this question. Are there any women tuba players?
That is a fantastic question. The answer is absolutely yes, there are. And there need to be more. But the first the Philadelphia Orchestra, they hired the first woman tuba player several years ago. And I haven't checked. I think she's still probably the only female tubist in a major symphony orchestra, but that is not because of anything but history. And I mean, they have women's brass conferences, and I think there's a lot of good progress being made there. And I've had plenty of students that are female. Tomoka was one of my first students at ISU. She came from Japan. She could play through the whole literature without breaking a sweat. She sounded great, but it wasn't for her. So I think she decided to go be an international airline pilot or something like that. So I guess second choice. But there's no physical limitation of any sort that I think in the past people have assumed was there.
I believe when I was at Butler University for my undergrad, the tuba professor was female.
Melissa Williams. Yep.
Yeah, Melissa. Yeah, is she still there? I think
she just retired maybe a year or two ago.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think she just retired, but
she's fantastic. And she's exactly. It's all cultural. It's getting better little by little.
Yep. All right, let me scroll on down here. Have you ever played with the tuba Christmas group?
I have. I've actually done, because I live in Bloomington here. I have played with the Tuba Santas with Harvey Phillips and those guys when Harvey was, still with us and heading that up. We would do that every, strangely, November in the square down here in Bloomington. And I participated in a couple of the tuba Christmases, you know, around. I mean, they're everywhere. And
The next question was with the Indianapolis Symphony. Have you done the Christmas concert there? So I don't.
I haven't done Yuletide. I've played with them a few times as a sub, but no. What I do is I do the Nutcracker, the Indianapolis Ballet, which started as the symphony, but since I didn't have two tuba players, they had me do the Nutcracker and he did Yuletide, and so you know we kind of gone our separate ways on that. Yeah, no, I haven't been able to play the Grinch yet. No.
And Betsy asked, do you still do the radiology stuff? I think you do, right?
Or that is my day job.
Yeah, that's your day job.
That is so I mean, you know, I was making a living and you know doing okay as a tuba player, but unfortunately it required a lifestyle that you know I didn't want to sustain for years and years and years and years, and so I made the call to study something else. And the cool thing about that is what I do essentially is I look at a person's CT scans, their, you know, basically all of their x-rays, their insides, and I, you know, determine how to, you know, bring radiation in without harming them. But what it requires me to do is look a lot at individual organs, and as you might imagine, quite often the lungs. And it's never a good thing that, you know, I'm having to look at somebody's lungs, but it has been very educational as to what's going on when we're breathing. The one thing about brass playing is it's all internal. I mean, it's not just brass players, but definitely brass players don't have all the external cues that maybe a string player might have, that you could say, oh, correct this way or correct that way. A lot of it's in here. And we're kind of looking at symptoms. Like you may have heard, like, don't puff your cheeks. Well, that's true and it's not true, because there's a wrong way to do it, and there's a way it just kind of happens naturally in certain places, but you're still doing the right thing. It's like trying to diagnose something based on a cough. Like you know, it could be any number of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean, well, you coughed, you're bad. And so, you know, being able to kind of study the human body gave me a lot of insight into, you know, much of what I do as a teacher and as a performer. And so I find I wind up using that knowledge all the time when I'm trying to, you know, communicate different things to students. I'm sure they hate it.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few studies. I've not been able to spend time to really read into them, but trying to find, because, you know, wind players, it's the same thing. It's all about oral cavity, and half the time I can't see what my students are doing, you know, my clarinet students. Their tongue needs to be a certain position, their oral cavity, their throat. And there's a lot of studies of trying to take a picture of the inside of their mouth and what the best way to do that is, and different experiments. And I'm wondering how that's all going to play out over the next 20, 25 years in pedagogy, because
Absolutely.
I think that could be really, you know, great for wind playing.
Yeah,
particularly.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Okay, last question from Sherry Daly. Do you ever play Bach on the tuba? And if you do, she wondered if you could play us a little clip.
Let's see. Yeah, I think I've got something around here. The answer is yes. Hang on just a second.
Do you ever do the cello suites or any of
the cello suites? Yes.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we do. It's definitely, especially the unaccompanied stuff. It can be challenging because you're out there and that's the only instrument that's doing it. But I played on my master's recital the second cello suite in D minor. And let's see if I can really quickly bring something up here.
With as he's bringing this up, there's a lot of low instruments that steal from the cellos. Bass clarinet is another one of them, often playing the Bach cello suites on recitals and whatnot.
Let's see. Okay, I found something. I can do it. Okay. Sorry, I have too many arrangements of the cello. Or I mean, additions. We'll go starker.
Do you find that they change the octaves and bring certain things down to make it fit within the tuba range rather than the cello?
Some people do.
Okay.
And they are smart. Some people don't. I mean, it's all a matter of what you're comfortable with, but yeah, it can be interesting. Okay. Let me see if there we go. I'll just play a little bit of the. Oh, this is in a different key, but I'll play it anyway. This is not even for tuba. Anyway, this would be in D minor. I apologize. Here,
for anyone that has perfect pitch.
Yeah, please turn it off.
Great, that actually works so well for the tuba.
Well,
I would never. Yeah.
He was an organist, and so I think a lot of his stuff, especially his solo stuff, it lies well because we're kind of trying to channel this pipe organ. Now I romanticize that way too much, but it gives us some ground to play with, and that definitely has been a lot of study of tuba players with Bach and all that, just because we're cut off from most of the repertoire, so we're just going to still don't have.
Right. Yep. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Glenn. This was really a wonderful presentation. We've got several comments coming through the chat. So thank you so much. Everyone, we will post this recording on our YouTube channel. And I wanted to give a quick shout out for our upcoming presentations in April. I'm going to pull my schedule up here real quick. On April 6th, we're going to welcome Keith Northover, who is our bass clarinetist, and he's not only going to share the bass clarinet, but he owns 30 plus clarinets of all different sizes and shapes. And it's going to be a really interesting presentation. He owns everything from the teeny tiny A-flat clarinet all the way to the contrabass B-flat clarinet. It's quite cool. And then on April 20th, we're going to welcome Jenny Kirby, who's our English horn player, and she also is going to share some of the other members of the oboe family, like the oboe da caccia and some of the other oboes that you saw on the videos that Rebecca McGuire, our principal oboe, shared. So she'll actually have those in person and be able to present those, as well as the English horn. And then hopefully in May, it looks like on May 18th, we're going to welcome Principal Flute Joyce Wilson, and she's going to do the flute. And then I'm hoping to get our Principal Bassoon Chad Roseland also scheduled for May, just not sure on the date yet. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Glenn. Hope everyone has a great rest of your week and enjoy this warm weather, although it's kind of raining here in Terre Haute.